Hello, everyone. I'm Marcelyn Gow, and I'd like to invite you to the third lecture in SCI-Arc's Fall 2021 lecture series. And we're very happy tonight to welcome our SCI-Arc community and our public community, both online. I know many of you are watching live streaming, and then those of you who are here with us in Keck tonight. So it's great to have this hybrid format. And today we are joined by an artist whose work brings forward the powerful presence of voices, never silent. We witness in Alison Saar's work the transmutation of raw matter as it begins to speak directly to us, unfolding the histories of violence and displacement that have shaped and continue to shape our present realities. Alison Saar's work reflects on the African diaspora and the histories of extraction that are marked indelibly by the violence of colonial and settler colonial oppression. Catherine Yusoff, in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, reminds us that no geology is neutral. Saar's sculptures evoke this emphatic non-neutrality as materials take on new properties to present us with what words cannot. In Saar's reanimation of Harriet Beecher Stowe's character, an enslaved girl named Topsy, steel wire becomes hair, and hair becomes power. Tin sheets that once lined a ceiling are hammered and punctuated by nails that outline the shape of a mouth that begins to speak to us, perhaps asking us to imagine a future that does not resemble in any way our present, a future at once empowering and bright. Alison Saar was born in Los Angeles, California. She studied art and art history at Scripps College and received an MFA from the Otis Art Institute. She received the United States Artist Fellowship in 2012 and has also been awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and 2 National Endowment Fellowships. Alison has exhibited at many galleries and museums, including the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Her art is represented in the collections of the Whitney Museum, the Baltimore Art Museum, the Modern Museum of Art, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Alison Saar to SCI-Arc for her lecture, The Thread That Leads to the Word. Thank you.
Let's do this, and we'll do this. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and all of those that are joining us online, and thank you to the staff and faculty and administration at SCI-Arc for the generous invitation to come and share my work with you all. So, the thread that leads to the word. Maybe, I don't remember how long ago, but a friend of mine, a gallerist named Boubacar Kone, said to me, he says, your work is the thread that leads to the word. And he's from Mali, and I was kind of curious about that. And basically, it's this idea of something that'll lead you to someplace else and hopefully lead you to a revelation or an understanding, kind of beyond what you already know. So I always loved that, and I've always kind of embraced that as kind of maybe the most wonderful things that have ever been said to me. And I'm going to start out actually showing a few artists that I find inspirational that also use thread and things of kind of like of women's handwork. One is Bessie Harvey, self-taught artist, who's works with found stuff. It looks like her grandkids' teeth are in here. She often uses her grandchildren's and children's hair. She would give them haircuts and incorporate their hair in her work. And so I love this idea of DNA, your actual DNA being in the work. Another would be Annie Mae Young, who's one of the Gee's Bend quilt makers. This is a corduroy quilt, and I love the geometry of this. Looks like Ashanti weavings. The other is Rosalee Tompkins, also from G's Bend, and this says, Zebedee Bell, June 18th, 1973, Cotton Farmer Guild, Arkansas. Married, lovely prince. Of this union, 11 children were born, and then it says Ruby. This is a blue jean quilt, and so basically they're all pieces of jeans. You can see some have pockets, some don't, but this idea that a family makes this quilt, and this art, again, has been worn and is kind of the refuse and the slough-offs of the family to kind of create a new piece. And then, of course, Ruth Asawa, who uses wire instead of instead of thread. But I love this weaving of things and these bringing togethers of this real simple line. And I think what I really love most about Ruth Asawa is this picture of her working here with her family. One bare-bottom baby drinking milk, and the other one sitting on the table drawing. And this idea of a mother working amongst her children, which is very similar to sort of my sort of upbringing, working in my mother's studio. And so actually here's a picture of myself and my older sister Leslie, topless, at the Watts Towers in 1958 or 59. I think I was 2 years old here. And then also this picture of myself with my two children, in Beige from Lamier Park, my daughter Maddie and my son Kyle, who are now quite grown up. But this idea that the children are always present in the studio, my studio has always been, well, up until maybe 5-6 years ago, my studio has always been at home. And just that's part of the process for myself in working. And I think, part of that process and part of the way I work, and we just mentioned the ceiling tin and kind of using it almost like fabric and cutting it and nailing it together. And sometimes working with assistants becomes like a sewing bee. And so I love this idea of a community within the studio. This piece is called Inheritance. And it was actually done right after I had met Boubacar Koné. He had invited me to show some work in Senegal. And I was just really sort of amazed by, just the inner strength of the children there, often, helping their parents or mother clean clothes or carry things on their heads to the market, often caring for their younger siblings, and kind of maybe in contrast to my own children who don't like even to take the trash out. I'm always dissing my kids, but I kind of looked at these children as sort of child atlases, and here's a child sort of balancing the world, a wounded world, bound world upon her head. And this also became sort of an homage to my mother, who lost her father at a very young age and was, on his deathbed, he asked her to help her mother take care of her younger siblings. My Uncle Bob was an infant at the time, and I think my Aunt Jay was maybe 1.5 or 2, and just really how it formed her and how she just became this really strong person who really feels like she needs to keep everybody else together, everyone else's shit together. So that's for moms. And actually my daughter was the model for this, and so I love that it's a portrait of my mother and at the same time a portrait of my daughter. This is a piece called Compton Nocturne. I was really, as you'll see, the music comes up a lot in my work. It's very inspirational, and in this case, kind of playing off of Duke Ellington's Harlem Nocturne, being from Los Angeles, I thought I'd switch it up and call it Compton Nocturne. And it's the kind of a playing off of the typical odalisque with, instead, she's got her kind of bottles in her hair. And this kind of comes out of the bottle tree tradition, which is a Southern thing that actually is a transatlantic tradition. And it really talks about these bottles kind of attracting spirits. Spirits are attracted to glitter and light, and how they become trapped inside them. So you put them outside your yard to keep it together. But in this case, these are trapping her own spirits, her own dreams, her own ideas. This piece is called Shorn. And so this is the wire that was also mentioned. It's basically baling wire or tie wire. But I love that it becomes hair and that it has a ferocity to it. It's often biting back. It's really strong and intense. And this piece, Shorn, is really about, I don't know if you can see, she's got a piece of glass in her hand, which she has used to cut all of her hair off. And I think this was also sort of marking a moment where I was experiencing an empty nest thing, and so this little pile of hair becomes the nest on her feet. She becomes in a nest herself, but also that a practice of sort of cutting off all of your hair and churning everything to kind of be made new again, and sort of the sloughing off of hair as sort of your past and stepping into the new light and the new world. She's only about 30 inches tall. And I should say they're all carved out of wood. This piece is called Cat's Cradle, and it's sort of talking about passage from childhood into womanhood. She's playing the child's string game, Cat's Cradle, but then you realize that the string is her menses blood that's coming from her vagina, and so it's kind of like still being a child and kind of coming into your menses, and sort of that struggle being between two worlds. This piece is called Cotton Eater. I don't remember what year it was, 2000. I don't remember what year it was, but it's a few years after Katrina. I got a residency at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans, and from the Esplanade down to the Treme, where I would ride my bike to my studio, or through the Treme down to the quarter, where I would ride my bike to the studio, I would go past house after house that still had red X's on the doors, and all of the contents of the house were strewn on the lawn. And some 5 years after Katrina, it was kind of like all of these promises that had been made in the midst and the aftermath of this horrible disaster in the United States, that all of those promises were then kind of retracted or never acted upon, and this idea of making New Orleans better than ever just became New Orleans whiter than ever, and that all those many of those neighborhoods have become gentrified, or else they were just never rebuilt. And so this is, I call it Cotton Eater, kind of going off of Ulysses' the Lotus Eaters, and this idea that if you sort of are fed false promises, that you will become full, but still not have any nutritional value to it. So she's has this long cotton bag that's full of cotton, and she's eating cotton. And this is the drawing of it. So I actually did this while I was at the Joan Mitchell Center, and the only thing I took was I didn't want to go there and try to make something that I'd already had started or anything. So I just kind of took an empty mind, and which is often not my state. But also I'd come across all these beautiful cotton sacks, or sugar sacks, cotton sugar sacks. And you can see all of that sort of is this staining, so it is as they were found. And I kind of opened them up and sewed a couple of them together. And I just love the idea that this material reflects the idea behind the piece. And so this is the drawing of the Cotton Eater. This piece is called 50 Proof. I was invited to go to, now the name of it's going to, Pilchuck, the glass blowing facility up just above Seattle in Washington State. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, because I just didn't really understand how glass could kind of be my work, and I work with very kind of rough materials. But I was really interested in the idea of alchemy and distillation, and how the history of glass kind of going through that, and this idea of something being hermetic and maybe resilient to acid and resilient to germs and resilient to so many things, and yet at the same time so fragile. So I really loved this sort of duality of this material and how it could be both very strong and very fragile. And also about the time that I was up there doing the residency was when Barack Obama was elected president, and while on one hand we all wanted to celebrate, we also started to see the first rising waters of the kind of tidal floods we are in now of racism and bigotry in America, that it never gone away, but now it basically had a voice. And so looking back at those early, really disturbing cartoons of watermelons on the White House lawn and whatnot was really a frightening and disturbing experience. And so I really kind of, just had to sit down and say, what does it take to sort of break down bigotry and racism? And I said, well, I think what we need to do is to basically get to the essence of it and understand what it is in its barest minimalist essence. And so to do that, I kind of created all of these distilleries. And it was an exhibition called Still, which meant, not only still like a moonshine still, but still we are still experiencing these same ideas and the same hatred. So this one is kind of a self-portrait, but it is also sort of a portrait of Obama being biracial, and myself being biracial. And so these are all pieces that are operated by the viewer. So by squeezing the little pump there, it siphons up this black water, which goes up and then fills this clear heart, half black, half white, and then drops down into her head, and then she cries black tears back into this basin, and it's the kind of playing off of the tragic mulatta. And so she has two choices, whether she's going to identify as black or white, and so she's got coal tar soap and ivory soap to choose from. And then this piece is called Wait. Again, pardon my puns, but I'm really inconstant in puns. I love playing with language. And so this piece is basically, I think on the first glance, it's a child sitting in a swing, but then you realize the child's been stripped bare, and then you realize that this swing is attached to a cotton weight. This is a scale that would be used in the fields to weigh cotton bags. And then that scale and her weight, basically her value is being equated with tools of manual labor. And so she's got a scythe, and she's got a skillet, and she's got chain and rope, and I think it's a coal scuttle that is basically her cornucopia. And I was just talking about how so many young people of color are coming out of school and still realizing that they are offered the same meager crumbs that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents were offered. And, again, how do we break this? And so basically, it is a balance. If you pick that scythe up, then she comes crashing down. And so she's totally kind of floats in this space, in this sort of terrifying limbo. This piece is called Deluge. Again, I was very intrigued, I think, looking into Katrina, that led me to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, and just kind of, this sort of precarious balance of, especially for African Americans, having often sort of a real tie to rivers and river culture, which is also something that came across the Atlantic when slaves were brought here. This idea of sort of Yamaya, Mamiwata, those spirits that are Yoruba spirits that are still, that have found their homes here in the States and in the Americas, and how, at some point the river is kind and giving and cleansing and purifying, and at other times she is terrifying and destructive and murderous. And so this is a portrait of her basically standing on her hair. And that's about 4.5 feet tall. And then this piece is called Breech, which was basically, again, inspired by the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, in which the Mississippi River flooded all the way from Illinois down to New Orleans. Basically, fields and homes were put under, up to 20 feet of water when the river breached its banks and its levees. And black males were conscripted to forcibly work on the levees, and so women were left to basically gather everything that they could and try to take it to higher ground. And then also African Americans were left and kind of, I would say, imprisoned on levees, that they were taken over to the levees and left there, and they became internment camps. They had to wear, similar to the Japanese American camps, they were forced to wear labels, and if they were to leave the levees, they would have to have permission to leave the levees. And so this is basically talking about the resilience and the strength of surviving those things. And so she's basically has all of these, everything she could gather balanced upon her head, and she's kind of pulling down the middle of the gallery. And I think it's like 13 feet tall. My studio is 14 feet tall, so I had some limitations. And these are just all the different objects that are balanced. And then I did some drawings of both breech and a male figure. And these are on burlap seed sacks, which actually would have been used similar, and they're probably from like the 20s or 30s. So they could have been sacks that would have been filled and used as sandbags as well. So I did a whole series kind of looking at that, and I was kind of intrigued with this sort of give and take of rivers and living in the soggy bottoms or silt towns or some of the other terminologies for it. And it was curious because all this music came out of that. There would be like Muddy Waters, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, a lot of songs that were kind of talking about the Great Mississippi Floods, and a few floods just prior to that and just after that. And then it was really curious because then white musicians started picking it up and making them into these kind of like dancey rags. And I forget, one of them was not the Black Bottom Blues, but some sort of black bottom rag or something. And it was, the lyrics were something with the darkies slipping and a sliding in the mud sort of thing. And this idea that you could make, dances out of a disaster. And so I decided to kind of create different dances with these dancing figures. And this one's called Silktown Shimmy. I had to go to the LA River to get some silt, so I survived the LA River. And then I did some paintings, also on just found materials. This was actually an old cot from the 1920s that could have been used on a camp. And so it's kind of talking again about sort of whether they're dancing and embracing this water or whether they're fleeing, and the vulnerability of living in flood-prone regions, because those are the only areas that blacks or people of color were allowed to buy houses, because it was undesirable land because it was underwater much of the time. This is Black Bottom Stomp. That's on hand-dyed linens and like towels and mattress ticking and some denim. And so, part of why I wanted to show the G's Bend quilts was that I found them really inspiring, and this is reflected in this work here. And then Silted Brows, sort of an homage to all of those that have perished in floods. And then I did this piece called Hades DWP, which stands for Department of Water and Power. And I was looking at sort of the 5 rivers of Hades and the underworld, and that sort of transition from the living to the dead, and how you have to cross all of these rivers, and each river would basically take something from you or remove something from your past life and push you towards, the world in the underworld. And this was an occasion where I asked Samia Bashir, a really amazing poet, to collaborate. And I said, I'm making these jugs, and these are etched glass jugs. They're all about a gallon, maybe a gallon and a half. And I said, would you be interested in writing, I said labels. And so she said, oh yeah, I would like to do that. But then when she came back with these things, and we ended up typing them or printing them on these kind of very sheer sort of rags. But she said, but they're not labels, they're voices. And it's, I think you can still find her reading these pieces. They're just really beautiful because she's very performative, and breath is a huge part of her work. And so also the different bottles came from different sources. The one with the Phlegathon, the river Phlegathon, which is the river of fire, is in a bottle that is a kerosene bottle, and then it has like a foundry ladle, a lead ladle for what to drink out of, and then I'm gonna forget the name of it, but the middle river is the river of oblivion. I think it's Acheron, which is sort of forgetfulness, which is kind of, you have to forget your past life to move on to this other world. And so that's kind of like the big gulp container there. And then for the show for Still, I had bought all these really beautiful old sort of salt glazed jugs. Some of them are quite huge. This one's probably maybe about a 12-inch jug in height, and for a flower arrangement. And then afterwards, I'm like, oh, what am I going to do with all these? And then I said, oh, these would be perfect to make kind of like genie lamps. And so this is Juke Joint Gin, which is really fun to say. And he's kind of this coming out of this moonshine bottle dancing. So then I did a show called Topsy Turvy at Ellie Louver, who represents me in Venice, California. And I guess usually I make my work and really try to give the work some sort of sense of optimism and hope. These pieces were made about 3 years ago, and it was really kind of hard to get my head in that place at that time. Of course, with the murders of so many men, women, and children by police and law enforcement, it was and is still disturbing and reoccurring terror that we live with every day. And I think what really got me going on this piece was hearing the tape by Philando Castile's girlfriend that she had shot on her phone, and you can hear her daughter in the background, in the back seat of the car, who saying, "I hope you don't get shooted, Mommy." And this notion of how does this child survive this trauma, and how do so many children survive trauma of fathers, brothers, sisters, mothers being shot by law enforcement, and children themselves being shot. And so I kind of wanted to create this army of young girls that were able to stand and push forward and continue the struggle. And so they all have tools of the 5 major crops, slave crops in the United States. So we've got rice is the sickle, cotton's in the foreground, tobacco and sugar and indigo. And these girls range, I guess, from 5 to maybe 11, 10 or 11. And what they've done is they've tied cotton bolls in their hair, so when they come through the fields, it serves as camouflage, and you can't see them creeping up on you. And they're ready to basically bring down the master's house with the master's tools. This piece is called Topsy and the Golden Fleece. I think the one thing I owe a great debt to my education at Scripps College was the humanities and studying the classics, and so that's why it crops up constantly in my work. But this idea of, I guess it's in the middle. It's funny that Topsy is a really minimal character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it was embraced by racist media. She took the forefront in many plays because it was like, oh, such fun to kind of degrade that character. But to me, she was always this sort of inquisitive child that just refused to let her spirit be broken. And, I guess Beecher Stowe, as being an abolitionist, wrote it that, this is what happens to children when they're sold off from their mothers, and when they're mistreated, and when they, don't have any education, they become these wild children and question everything that the white saviors want to give them. And so I wanted Topsy to embrace that and to be empowered by that sort of stubbornness, and empowered by her mistreatment as opposed to being broken down by her mistreatment. And at one point in the story, little Eva, who basically is the polar being of Topsy, where Topsy is described as being dark-skinned and having sundry tails for her hair. Eva's white and blinding golden hair that almost burns the eyes because it's so bright and so beautiful, and she's so pure. And so in the story, she unfortunately falls ill, and she's kind of handing out strands of her hair to all the household slaves and field slaves that have gathered around to say goodbyes to her. And this has been sort of speculated that this is basically Eva giving the gift of Christianity and light to ignorant, impoverished slaves. But I like the idea that Topsy figures out the scam and says, well, if her power is in her golden blonde hair, I don't want a few strands, I'm just going to take the whole scalp. So here she is holding poor little Eva's scalp. And this is the Wrath of Topsy, which is sort of a battle banner. And then I thought we also needed someone in the big house to keep an eye on things. And so this is white guys, a light-skinned slave, mulatto slave, often sired by her master. And she's holding an iron, so that's her basic, her tool of, to get out of the house. And if you look at the tip of her little flat iron, you can see a little bead of blood gathering. And then this is, again, kind of playing off of that odalisque piece called Bitter Crop. And then I had promised myself when I was doing the show that I would have a happy ending, that I would have some sort of light at the end of this dark tunnel. And it was really tough to get to that place. The best I could come up with was Jubilee, which is Topsy cutting off all of her braids as sort of a self-liberating act. And then this is her. There's a line where I guess Aunt, I forget her name, is asking Topsy who made her, hoping that she would say, Jesus made me or God made me. And then Topsy just kind of turns to her and said, ain't nobody made me. I expect I was just growed. And I love that she sort of flatly rejects Christianity at that point in time and embraces her for who she is, that nobody gave her anything. So then I did a show that was featured in Freeze LA, and I really, after all of this anger and sort of frustration and fear and this pain and anguish, I wanted to kind of have work that felt very homing and embracing, and I turned to the kitchen, which in my home, growing up, my grandmother's kitchen was really a prominent part of our lives, and even our home at home. My mother used the kitchen as her studio, and so much time was spent by all in the kitchen. It wasn't just a place to eat or cook. It was also a place where hair was hot combed, and it was a place where art was made. It was a place where homework was done. So all things happened at the kitchen table. And so that kind of led me to this whole other body of work. And much of this is looking at the rigmaroles of hair straightening. And so this one is called the Congoline Resistance. And it's supposed to be like the top of a pomade lid. And actually one of the pomade tins had something that was good for the most stubborn and kinky hair. And so I like this idea that she's embracing her stubborn and kinkiness, and so she's resisting congoline, which is a processing of the hair to straighten your hair, and then she holds in her teeth a hot comb. And then I started doing these small, tiny pieces with actual hot combs. This was during COVID, and so, a lot of the work that I did was very small prints and really small carvings. I had to learn how to whittle, so that was really exciting. And this piece is called Hot Comb Hate, Her name is Caledonia. And this one is Sapphire. So they're maybe 10 inches tall altogether. And then I decided to make a big one. So this one's called the Big Singe, and it's about 7 feet tall. So I made a hot comb. It's made out of wood, but it looks like a hot comb, right? And I love that all these hot combs, I didn't want to use our family hot combs, so I ordered a bunch of them from eBay, but I loved that the one thing they all had in common was that they were burned like 3 inches into the comb from being left on the fire too long or getting a little too close to the fire. And so the Big Singe is really kind of not talking so much about singeing of the handle, but the singeing behind your ears and at the nape of your neck, if you were too fidgety. And then I did a piece called Kitchen Amazon. And so this is a figure, and it's kind of, on one hand, referencing Josephine Baker with her banana dress for the Folies Bergère. But really kind of, again, looking at mythology, Greek mythology, and the story of the Queen of the Amazons who had this like girdle that was like empowered her, and it was her source of power. And of course, some, the guys come up and say, I want your girdle. I need to take it back to my queen. And she's like, cool, you can have my girdle. But then, somehow that got miscommunicated somewhere along the line. And basically, the entire island of Amazon women were murdered by these guys who wanted to steal her girdle in the first place. So again, I wanted to kind of switch up that story and have a happy ending. And here she is. Her girdle is made out of skillets, these really powerful, heavy things. And I think of women as providers of nutrition and order and, bringing order to all of the chaos in the world. And so she is holding these things, which are kind of like also a chastity belt to a certain respect. I think those skillets are really heavy. I think that's almost 100 pounds of skillet she got on her hips. But then she also holds a skillet aloft on her shoulder in case someone needs to be smacked upside the head with it. And I love, I think my attraction to skillets, and I use the skillet a lot in my work, was when my grandmother died, that was the one heirloom I wanted, was my grandmother's skillet. And if you can look close, you can see all of the caked on grease on the backside of it. The inside's always smooth and clean, but the back always shows the history of all the meals that have been made with it. And I just love that there's sort of this residue of lives lived on these different skillets. And then this is Sorrow's Kitchen. Been to Sorrow's Kitchen and licked the pots clean. I'm really bad at paraphrasing, but that's from Zora Neale Hurston. And so this is a woman looking in the pot, and then she sees her reflection. And then this piece, Set to Simmer, again, kind of playing off of the odalisque, only in this case, instead of, she's basically saying, if you're going to be looking at me, instead of this, traditionally they're very coyly sort of, have their privates covered with one hand, and they're looking in their mirrors, their vanity, and it's all very sort of alluring. And of course, they're all painted by men. And so this is, a different sort of odalisque where she's like, don't be looking at me out of the corner of your eye, mop up that drool. If you're going to look at me, really look at me. And so the viewer is invited to come and sit down in this seat and look at her, and to see what they can perceive by her body. But then also, instead of holding up a mirror, she's holding up a skillet. But there's this little drawer, and this again was another collaboration with a poet, Dion Brand, excuse me. And so you open it up, and I just asked her, I said, I'm going to be doing this drawer, this catch-all drawer, which probably you all have one, or your mother has one, or your grandmother has one. That drawer where you put short bits of string and, miscellaneous keys that you don't know where they go to and whatnot, half-used spools of thread. And so she sent me these things, and I typed them on pieces of twill and on little tiny key labels and on these different pieces of paper. And so this idea is you sit and you look at this woman, but then you open this drawer and you see who she is beyond this body. And you see, they're basically just these kind of really ethereal, strange fragments, dreams, half-finished sentences. And it's just a really beautiful sort of invitation inside someone's head. And then I did this little piece, Blue Boy. Of course, Kehinde Wiley's now doing Blue Boy. Everybody's got to do Blue Boy. But at any rate, this is my version of Blue Boy, and kind of looking at sort of the indigo industry, which also indigo was one of the major reasons for importing slaves to the Americas, to the Carolinas, was to make this blue gold, basically, that this dye was worth a lot of money in Europe. And so, and in fact, I think probably the garments that Blue Boy is wearing, the painting Blue Boy is wearing, was probably dyed with indigo. And so here he is with his hoe, and he has basically cut out somebody's heart. He's got somebody's heart in his hand. There you go. And then I did this painting called Torch Song, and I think the last piece I've got is this piece, Torch Song. And I think this was basically sort of paying tribute to all the amazing female singers, Black female singers who, notably folks like Nina Simone or Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey, and who, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and who sing these songs, and often these songs are talking about, survival, and they're cloaked as love songs, but they're really songs of resistance. And so her music is her weapon, and so I kind of did these piano keys, almost like a bandolier, very Viva Zapata-ish. And I think that's all I have to share with you, but I would love to take on some questions if y'all got any.